My Safety Training Online presents Scaffold Safety. What will you learn from this safety training program? The definition of a scaffold, scaffold-related terms, what a competent person is defined as, types of scaffolds, along with their definitions and examples, scaffolding hazards and controls, how to inspect a scaffold correctly, how and when to train for scaffolding on affected persons, and finally a summary. Part 1, Scaffold Definitions. What is a scaffold? The answer is an elevated temporary work platform, separated into three basic types. First, you have your support scaffolds, platforms supported by rigid load-bearing members such as poles, legs, frames, and outriggers. The types of scaffolds also include suspended scaffolds, platforms suspended by ropes and other non-rigid overhead support, aerial lifts such as cherry pickers or boom trucks. Types of scaffolds include suspension scaffolds, which of course are platforms suspended by ropes or wires, and they must be capable of supporting 6 times the load which they are requested to handle. You must train employees to recognize hazards, secure or tie down to prevent swaying. Support the devices must rest on surfaces that can support 4 times the load. A competent person is one who evaluates connections to ensure supporting surfaces can support the load and inspect the ropes for defects before the shift. A PFAS must have anchors independent of the scaffold system. Type of scaffolds include moving scaffolds. Remember that employees cannot be on moving scaffolds unless the scaffold has a surface that is level and the height to base ratio is 2:1. Outriggers are installed on both sides of the scaffolds, and employees can't be on the scaffold beyond the part of the wheels. A competent person must be on the site supervising the operation. Band scaffolds include shore scaffolds, which are supported scaffolds which are placed against a building on the structure and held in place with props. Lean-to scaffolds, which are supported by scaffolds which are kept erect by tilting them towards and resting against the building or structure. And of course, don't work on snow or ice-covered platforms during storms or high winds. Part 2, Scaffold Hazards. Falls from elevation can be caused by slipping, unsafe access, and the lack of fall protection. Struck by falling tools and debris, electrocution from overhead power lines, scaffold collapse caused by instability or overloading, as well as bad planking giving way. Fall hazards. Fall hazards may occur at a job site while climbing on or off the scaffold, working on an unguarded scaffold platform, when scaffold platforms or planks fail, or falls can occur when you are checking out of a hot chick like her, so be sure to be careful where you're looking. Falling object protection. Always wear hard hats in a barricade area below the scaffold and forbid entry into that area. Use panels or screens if the material is stacked higher than the toe board. Here we can see an example of a good scaffold support on the left and one on the right that's inadequate and could collapse. Moving scaffold hazards. Employee was operating an aerial lift with an extended boom rotating work platform. The platform boom was fully extended, but the machine apparently ran over some bricks, causing the boom to flex or spring, throwing the employee 37 feet from the basket. Hear ye, it's time for part 4, scaffolding done the correct way. What is the definition of a competent person? I'm so glad you asked. A competent person is a person capable of identifying and promptly correcting hazards. They determine if it's safe to work on the scaffold during storms or high winds. They train workers to recognize hazards. And they select qualified workers to conduct the work. How does a competent person inspect? Well, a competent person inspects scaffolds for visible defects before each shift and after any alterations. Of course, defective parts must be immediately repaired. Scaffolds can be erected, moved, dismantled, or altered under the supervision of a competent person. Competent persons will select and direct these workers and determine the feasibility of fall protection. Who can be trained as a scaffold erector? Well, employees trained on scaffold hazards to control these hazards, controls on scaffold hazards and procedures to control the hazards can be. The training must include the nature of electrical, fall, and falling objects hazards, how to deal with electrical hazards and fall protection systems, the proper use of scaffold, and scaffold load capacities. They must be retrained as necessary. Scaffold erector training must include training employees in erecting, disassembling, moving, operating, repairing, maintaining, or inspecting a scaffold to recognize hazards. And correct procedures to use the scaffold, of course. Scaffold safety summary. Remember to use scaffold construction methods, ensure proper scaffold access, and properly use a competent person for all situations involving scaffold. When constructing scaffold platforms, remember that the platform must be fully planked or decked with no more than 1-inch gaps. It must be able to support its weight plus 4 times the maximum load, and it must be at least 18 inches wide. Guardrails and scaffolding. Remember to install along open sides and ends a front edge of a platform not more than 14 inches from the work, unless guardrails are installed and a PF personal support system. Top rails are 38 to 45 inches tall. The mid rails are halfway between the top rail and the bottom rail, and the toe boards are at least 3.5 inches high. Personal fall arrest systems. Each individual mounting the scaffold must be trained in how to properly use a PFAS. That includes anchorage, lifeline, and body harness. Fall protection includes using your PFAS instead of guardrails in some situations. Using your PFAS and guardrails on suspension scaffolds, using your PFAS on erectors and dismantlers where feasible. Protecting your head wherever possible. Wear a hard hat. Remember the barricades area below the scaffold area to prevent entry into that area. Use panels or screens if the material is tacked higher than the toe board. Build a canopy or erect a net below the scaffolding so it might contain or deflect anything falling from the scaffold. Building a scaffold. Remember that no large gaps on the front edge of the platforms. Each must be a butted end of the plank must rest on a separate support surface. Overlap the platforms at least 12 inches over supports, unless they restrain to prevent movement. Scaffolding safety includes no painting on wood platforms, using scaffold grade wood, a fully planked front upright and guardrail support, using component pieces that must be matched of the same type, and erecting on stable and level ground, locking the wheels and braces. Platforms supported by legs, outrigger beams, brackets, poles, uprights, posts, and frames. Restrained from tipping by guys, ties, and braces. Scaffold poles, legs, posts, frames, and uprights must be on base plates and mud sills or other firm foundation. Scaffold safety includes providing access when scaffold platforms are more than 2 feet above or below a point of access. Permitted types of access include ladders such as portable, hook-on, attachable, stairway type, or built-ins, as well as stairway towers, ramps, and walkways. You may use the building stairs and come out a window. Scaffold forbidden items. No access to the scaffolds by using the cross braces. When using ladders, the bottom rung should be no more than 24 inches high. You can use some end frames, and you can access the scaffold from another scaffold, structure, or hoist. Overhand bricklaying is from supported scaffolding. A guardrail or personal fall rest system is required on all sides except the side where the work is being done. Scaffolding safety rule number 1 is employees are prohibited from moving to be on a moving scaffold except in specific situations. Scaffold supports must meet a minimum safety standards discussed in this training. Employees must have training for the scaffold erection that meets the OSHA criteria. At least 12 inches overlapping coverage is required on planks. Only a competent person can inspect and train. Competent persons must meet the standards minimum criteria. And there are 3 basic types of scaffolds.